Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a book haul revisit for the month of December. This is where I look at book hauls from the month of December in the past to see how many of the books I've read, how many I would still like to read, gauge how many I have unhauled, and especially how many I unhauled without actually reading, and think about which ones I might possibly want to unhaul in the future. I have 5 Decembers that I am going to look back at. And in order to make this not such a long and unwieldy video, I will not get into a lot about what these books are about. If you want information about what each book is about, I will have a link to the original book haul video down below. You'll get all of that information in that video. And if you go to those, you might notice that there are more books in the book haul than we are going to cover here. In order to streamline this and keep it relatively short, or at least a little shorter, I have removed books that were purchased for my Pulitzer Prize project. I am doing a Pulitzer Prize project where I'm reading all of the books that have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So anything that was purchased for my Pulitzer Prize project is not going to be here because there's a different set of accountability for that. It's a project, and that's why I purchased it. I decided I wanted to have copies of all of those books. So it's very different from purchasing a book with the intention of reading it soon. I have also gotten rid of library builders. There was a period where I was buying all of Louise Erdrich's books because I wanted to have every one of them. Toni Morrison is the same thing. So I've removed those. I have eliminated circumstances where I had already read a book and decided I wanted to have a copy because, again, I already read it. And purchasing it to have in my library is a very different thing than spending money on something with the intention of reading it. And I am also getting rid of anything that was given to me, whether by a publisher or by a friend or someone who subscribes to my channel. The real intent here is to try to hold myself accountable for books that I spent money on with the intention of reading them soon and see how I did and hold myself accountable for whether or not I have read those books and try to make myself a bit more of an intentional book purchaser. One thing that I have learned in book haul revisits is that I tend to read nonfiction books on audio much more than I am in print. And I like to think that that has been helpful for me when I think about purchasing new books. It's just an interesting concept. And again, I will mention that the idea for book haul revisits came from Doris et al. D. Books. I will have her channel linked down below. She doesn't do book haul revisits anymore, but she did for a time. So I kind of stole the concept from her and ran with it. So let's dive in, and we're going to start with the most recent book haul and work our way back into the past. So we'll start with December of 2023, 1 year ago, and work our way back to December of 2019. Now, for our criteria, there were 3 books that I brought into my library last December that meet our criteria. And let's see what they are and how I did. The first was This Is Happiness by Niall Williams. I did read this book this year. I actually ended up listening to it on audio, but I did read it, and I'm really glad. I did not manage to fit this book in before I went to Ireland because that had been the intention. I went to Ireland in May, and I caught up to it once we got home, and I really liked it. We don't have to get into a lot about it, but this is a success story. It was purchased because I wanted to read a lot of Irish books before going to Ireland, and I caught up to it after the fact. So this is a success story. And then we have Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee. This is a tiny little book. I have not gotten around to reading it yet. This sort of heads into the idea of a library builder. I have read Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee, and I haven't read any of his other books. And Waiting for the Barbarians is one that I consistently hear good things about. So I didn't have any immediate intention to purchase this book. I also got it at my local used bookstore, so it was really cheap. And I wasn't planning to get to it quickly. This was more of a case where, like I said, when I think of library builders, it's like something where having it on your shelf will hopefully increase your likelihood to get to it at some point in the future, even if you don't have immediate plans. I also used to, at one point in the past, collect these Penguin Great Books of the 20th century. So obviously toward the end of the 20th century, they started releasing these books, and there would be a beautiful illustration on the cover. and there would be, I believe it's the opening sentence on, and then they have these French flaps where you get the actual plot description. I used to collect them. I don't have very many of them anymore. So just to have this edition was pretty nice. So I haven't read it yet. At some point in the future, I would get to it. It doesn't take up a lot of room on my shelf. So I don't really think of this as a failure. Like I said, I didn't have immediate plans, and it was pretty cheap. So that's not bad. The final book was also part of my Irish reading journey that I was going to go on. I really wanted a copy of The Country Girls by Edna O'Brien, and I could not find it in used bookstores or really anywhere. So my local used bookstore happened to get a copy of The Little Red Chairs by Edna O'Brien. So I grabbed it just in case. Now, I haven't read it because eventually I did find a copy of The Country Girls, and I have read 2 out of the 3 novellas that comprise that trilogy. So this is now in a bit of a weird limbo space because I got the Edna O'Brien book I actually wanted, but I did really like the 2 out of the 3 novellas that I've read so far. So at some point in the future, I would get to this, but it sort of got supplanted. So I don't have a sense of urgency to get to this, but I'm going to hold on to it. And at some point, I would like to get to it. But I want to finish the Country Girls trilogy first. So I don't think of this as a failure either, that I haven't gotten around to reading this one. So of the 3 books I brought into my library that qualify for our purposes here today, I've read 1 out of 3, which is not great. That is 33% of the books that I brought in. I have not unhauled any. And my watch out criteria, or what I have decided is my watch out criteria for these book haul revisits, is books that I have unhauled without reading. That is the criteria I want to be extremely careful of. And since I haven't unhauled any of these books, you can guess that I have no books that I unhauled without reading. And, you know, I feel like The Little Red Chairs is the only one that might end up sitting in my library for a long time without having been read. Waiting for the Barbarians is something that I feel a little more urgency to get to. So if you've read The Little Red Chairs, let me know what you thought of it below. But I feel like that's the only one that might end up waiting a really long time for me to read, but I don't have immediate plans to get rid of it. So if you have feedback on it, let me know. And maybe that will help me bump it up a little bit more. Let's go back to December of 2022 and go to there. Interestingly, this was not planned. I am currently reading the first book that comes from this book haul. It's The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayer. And this was a complete accident because basically I finished an audiobook that I was listening to. I couldn't really decide what I was in the mood for, so I got on the Libby app and started scrolling through the Queer Liberation Library and audiobooks that were available immediately. And one of them was The Sleeping Car Porter. So I decided to start listening to it. And at this point, I am almost done. I think I have about an hour left of the audio. So because I'm currently reading this, I am going to count it as something that I have read. And this was something that consistently since I got it, I have wanted to catch up to. So I'm really glad that I am finally doing it. And so far, it's great. We'll see what the last hour and a half of the audio is like. But we're going to count that as a success story. Total coincidence that I happen to be reading it right now. And that's just something that's kind of like a funny little quirk of timing. Then we have a graphic novel flung out of space, inspired by the indecent adventures of Patricia Highsmith by Grace Ellis and Hannah Templer. I did read this. This, I believe, had been included in the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2022, and it sounded absolutely fascinating. And my library didn't have a copy, so I decided to order a copy and purchase it for myself, and I did. And I thought it was just okay. There are aspects of this that are really interesting, but I wish it had gone into its subject matter with a little more depth. And we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about that because that's not the intention of this video. We're really just here to see how many of the books I have read. And I have read this. So that's great. I don't feel like I'm going to need to keep it in my library forever, but I'm not really hurting for space in my graphic novels and graphic memoir section, which is on this bookshelf behind me over there. So it's going to hang out. It's interesting enough that I will keep it, but I can see an area in the future where I might have unhauled it, but that's fine because I read it and that doesn't meet my watch out criteria. So the next one is The Stone Angel by Margaret Lawrence. I have heard good things about this book. They actually mentioned it for the first time that I heard about on the New York Times Book Reviews podcast. And that really piqued my interest. I think I reached out to Sean Breathe's books after that and asked him if he had read it, and he was a fan. And I happened to find this copy of the book in my library for $1. So I grabbed it. And one thing I'm going to think about next year is whether or not I want to really hold myself accountable for books that I only really spent $1 on. Because the thing is, it's different to hold myself accountable for a hardcover graphic novel that cost $24.99 than it is to hold myself accountable for a paperback that I spent $1 on. So I think one way I'm going to keep streamlining my book haul revisits next year is I'm going to start thinking about whether or not I'm going to include books that I didn't spend a lot of money on. I haven't read this yet, and this was a library builder. I didn't have any intention to get to it quickly. And again, the fact that I spent only $1 on it makes me not feel bad that I haven't read it yet. Whereas if I had spent $25 on a book and hadn't read it, I might feel like, okay, that's something I need to learn from. But that's not the case here. So I haven't read it, but I still really want to. And if you would like to give me feedback about this book and maybe encourage me to prioritize it for 2025, let me know in the comment section down below. That takes us to 3 books by Nao Marsh. And I believe they are the first 3 books in that series of books following a detective. I am completely blank. Roderick Allen, I think is his name. They had been recommended to me. So there's A Man Lay Dead, Enter a Murderer, and The Nursing Home Murder. I read all 3, and I was not a very big fan. So I didn't feel like I needed to keep the whole collection of them. This was not a case like Sue Grafton. I have like every Sue Grafton book up there. I didn't feel like I needed to keep them. So I read them, but then I got rid of them. And the third one in particular got into some weird eugenics stuff that really didn't age well. So I didn't feel like I needed to keep them. I might continue reading the series at some point, but it wasn't something I was particularly enjoying. So 3 books, I read all 3 and got rid of all 3. And the final book that I brought into my library in December of 2022 was 7 Houses, a Memoir of Time and Places by Josephine W. Johnson. I was particularly interested in this book because as part of my Pulitzer Prize project, actually I shouldn't even count this one because this kind of is adjacent to my Pulitzer Prize project, but I've already done the math and I've already started filming, so we're not going to change at this point. She won a Pulitzer Prize for a book called Now in November, which I read and was fascinated by. And there is an idea, I'll link the video down below where I talk about this, but she may have been blacklisted from the publishing industry. So I wanted to read her memoir. And there's actually not a lot of information about that in this. There's a little bit more sort of hints of it in The Inland Island, which is a really fantastic nonfiction book that Josephine Johnson wrote. And but this was sort of an addendum to my Pulitzer Prize project. And I did read it, and I'll link the video where I incorporate this into a discussion down below because I think it was really fascinating. Ignore my calendar. So, of the 7 books that I brought into my library in December 2022, at least the ones that qualify for our purposes here, I've read 6 out of 7. The only one that I haven't read yet is The Stone Angel by Margaret Lawrence. And that is 86% as a success rate, which is really good. And I have unhauled 3 of those books, which is 43% of that book haul. But I'd read all of them. So not a single book that I unhauled meets my watch out criteria, which is pretty good. And let's hold on to that because there will be ones that eventually do meet that criteria that we get to. Let's move to December of 2021 and talk about all the books I got for my library then. The first one was Fairyland, a Memoir of My Father by Alicia Abbott. And I have not read this book yet. I cannot remember how I heard about this book and became interested in reading it. I admit there's not as much urgency to read it right now as there was then, but I feel totally fine holding on to it and maybe eventually getting around to reading it. It's since I purchased it, it was adapted into a movie. The movie had a very quiet release. I don't even know if it would be available on streaming. It certainly wasn't available in a theater anywhere near where I live. But I'm still fascinated. I would still like to get around to reading it. This was something that my library didn't have a copy of. There were no audios. So I did order it from Montana Book Company, and it's a $15.95 book. So that's kind of where this is something that I brought into my library with the intention of reading at the time. And now this was 2021. So 3 years later, I still haven't read it. But I would still like to. So that counts for something. So, and I have periodically seen it on my shelf and thought about it. So, I haven't read it yet, but I don't have any intention to get rid of it, and I would still be very curious to read it. Then we have Guapa by Salim Haddad. I believe I heard about this one on Jen the Librarian's channel, and it sounded really fascinating, so I had to order a copy of this from the UK, which is like an extra layer of intent to read something. So that makes it a little more sad that 3 years later I haven't gotten around to reading it, but I still really want to. And again, this is something that I have seen on my shelf and thought, ooh, I need to read that. So hopefully at some point I will get around to it. And both Fairyland and Guapa would be natural fits for my Pride Month pile of possibilities in 2025. So maybe 2025 will be the year that I finally get around to reading them. We shall see. But as of yet, I have not read either one. Then there is The Intoxicating Mr. Lavelle by Neil Blackmore. I started this book and I got about 60 or 70 pages in and decided to DNF it. And immediately took it to my local used bookstore and traded it in for credit. So I'm counting it as something that I have read, but I just really was not enjoying the book very much. So I said goodbye to it. And that's all we need to say about that. Next, we have Oh Beautiful by Jung Yoon. This is a situation where this book had been recommended to me. And by the way, gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous cover. And it sounded really interesting to me, and my library didn't have a copy, and the audio wasn't available anywhere. So after waiting, I think like a month or 2 months for it to become available somewhere, and it didn't, I broke down and ordered a copy of the book. And here I am 3 years later, and I haven't read it yet. But I still want to. It does sound like a really interesting book. So I'm still going to think about reading it. I might do it on audio instead of in print at some point. If you've read this, I would love to hear what you thought of it in the comment section down below. Let me know. I'm not going to get rid of it. I don't have any intention to do that, especially since at this portion of the alphabet, I'm not really hurting for space right now. But I feel like I'm eventually going to read it. I don't have any intention to get rid of it. So we'll see how that goes. Then we have some failures. Failure is a very strong word, but some books that meet my watch out criteria. Spoiler alert. Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. I got this one because it had been appearing on some best of lists for that year, and I got very curious. Curiosity got the better of me. And at some point, I realized I just didn't feel too much of a sense of urgency to read it anymore, so I got rid of it. And Tastemakers, 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America. That one, I think, fell victim. I'm still interested in reading that book. I was actually surprised that I had unhauled it, but it's not on my nonfiction shelf, which is behind me over here. So I must have at some point over the last year. And if I did, which apparently I did, I assume it was because I decided that this was a book that I was much more likely to listen to on audio than I would be to read it in print. And for that reason, I didn't really need to have it in my library. I'm assuming that's what my decision-making process was. It would kind of make sense. So I'm pretty sure I have the audio saved somewhere on one of my subscription apps, but it is no longer in my library. And then the final book is The 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and in collaboration with the New York Times Magazine. I have a signed copy. I admit this is definitely something that I would most likely be likely to listen to on audio. I knew that when I purchased this copy of the book. I purchased it because I thought the project was important, and I purchased it because at the time, conservative media people were actively trying to get this off of the bestseller lists. So I thought, I'm going to buy myself a copy of the book. And I fully admit that that is why I got it. So at some point, I will probably listen to the audio of this. And in the meantime, I'm happy to have the book because, again, I feel like it was a very important project to support, and it is a beautiful book. So Of the 7 books I brought into my library in 2021, we sort of have the opposite situation of 2022. I've read 1 out of 7, which is only 14%. And the one that I read was The Intoxicating Mr. Lavelle, which, technically speaking, I DNF'd. I have unhauled 3 of the books, which is 43%. And of those books that were unhauled, 2 of them had been unhauled without reading. That makes up 29% of the overall 2022 book haul. And that's not great, because that's the criteria I want to be careful of. Books that I spend money on and ultimately get rid of without reading. That is what I want to be careful of. So not great, but not terribly bad either. Let's go back to December of 2020 and talk about the books I got. The first one is something I unhauled. It's The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. I had been really excited to read that book. I did, and when I did, I kind of just thought it was okay. I didn't really feel bowled over. I kind of felt meh about it, being honest. But I decided I didn't need to keep it in my library, and I traded it in. But I did read it, so there is at least that. Then there is Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner. I admit I had actually about 2 years ago thought about potentially unhauling this. I kind of got it on a whim because it sounded like a really interesting book. And then I saw some people on BookTube mention this book and that they really enjoyed it. So that made me want to hold on to it. And actually, it's a very short book. And I have this beautiful hardcover edition of it. So yeah, it's barely over 200 pages. So at some point, I'll probably get around to it. I don't have any sense of urgency to do it. And point is, at the end of the day, I don't have plans to get rid of it. And although I don't really intend to read it soon, hopefully someday I will. And in the meantime, I have a book that seems really interesting in my library, and I'm pretty okay with that as well. Then we have The Moors Account by Leila Lalami. This is from when I was a member of Book of the Month. Actually, so is Lolly Willows. And part of the reason I got rid of my Book of the Month membership, being honest, is I felt like a lot of the books that were ending up sitting in my library and eventually getting unhauled without being read were books that I got because I felt like I should use my monthly credit. And sometimes I would be kind of impulsive about something, and that was the case with The Moors Account. This was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, so that was actually the thing that made me, when I saw it, think, ooh, it's kind of an addendum to my Pulitzer Prize project, so I should get it. And then in the years since, I admit, I don't really have any sense of urgency to read this, but I do fairly consistently hear good things about the book. So I don't have immediate plans to get rid of it. But if in another year or so I haven't gotten around to it, which is a big possibility, I might think about getting rid of it. Although it is a really beautiful hardcover edition of the book. So if you've read this, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, because maybe that will encourage me to actually read it. Then we have 10 minutes, 38 seconds in This Strange World by Elif Shafak. This had been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. That is entirely where my interest in reading this came from. I am kind of surprised that I haven't gotten around to it. I think when a book is part of a book prize conversation and then that book prize ends and gives the prize to someone, and especially when that book does not win the prize for that year, it's interesting. Sometimes you still have that sense of urgency tied to it, and sometimes the conversation moves on to other things. I would still really like to read this book at some point. So hopefully at some point I will. And hopefully having it in my library will make me get around to it at some point. Then we have this double book edition of Betty Smith novels. I got it because I felt like it's a nice sort of vintage copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. It also has Maggie-Now. I've ended up reading neither. And this was probably not a great decision, although it wasn't expensive. I got this from my local used bookstore, so I didn't spend a lot of money on this. But I think the mistake is that this is an edition of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn that I would feel uncomfortable reading because I don't want to damage the book. And it has a Betty Smith novel that I don't really have a lot of urgency to get to. So at the end of the day, if I do decide I want to read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, I don't want to read this copy. So I'm probably going to do it on audio, or I'm going to go to my library and get a copy from them. And that's not practical. not practical at all. It also takes up a lot of space on my shelf. So, oh well, I'm learning. I am learning. So I haven't read either one of these books, but I'm going to only count them as one for our purposes today. So of the 5 books that I brought into my library in December of 2020, I have only read one, and that was The Office of Historical Corrections. That's 20% of the book haul. I've unhauled one, The Office of Historical Corrections, for 20% of this book haul, and none of them have been unhauled without reading, because I had read The Office of Historical Corrections before getting rid of it. Let's move to December of 2019, which is a very interesting book haul revisit because I don't have any of the books anymore. There were only 3 of them. Let's get into it. The first one was Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. Again, this was like right around the time I joined Book of the Month. I got it because it sounded really interesting and people were really excited about that book because Gia Tolentino is or was a writer for the New Yorker. I believe she's still there. And I did not get along with it. I read it and just let it go from my library. So at least I read it. Then also from Book of the Month Club, I got Long Bright River by Liz Moore. And this is something where over the years, the urgency to read it really died down. Although people do consistently recommend it to me, actually. And I don't read that type of book very much anymore. And I started thinking to myself that if I were to read it, I'd be much more likely to listen to it on audio. So I decided to let it go. That was before we expanded my library and I didn't have as much space as I do now. So sometimes I had to make really tough decisions about what I was going to keep and what I was going to get rid of. And Long Bright River was one of those tough decisions, but I didn't read it, so it hits my watch out criteria. And then The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. I was surprised that I had gotten rid of this book, but I couldn't find it on my shelf, so I must have gotten rid of it at some point. And I think I'm guessing that I had decided because I started it, I got about halfway in and I think I wasn't in the mood for it, really just not in the mood for it. So I put it down. And I wanted to revisit it at some point. So that's kind of why I'm surprised I got rid of it. But I think if I do, I'd probably end up doing it on audio and see if that helps me get through the book. I really just think I wasn't in the mood for it. But I'm a little surprised that I had gotten rid of it, which I must have since I can't find it anywhere in my library. So of those 3 books that I got in December of 2019, at least the ones that qualify for our discussion today, I read 2. And again, I only read about half, maybe a little less than half of The Left Hand of Darkness, but I'm going to count it. And I did read Trick Mirror, and so it's 67% of that December 2019 book haul. I unhauled all 3. That's 100%. Easy math. But only one of them had been unhauled without reading it, and that is a 33% watch out rate. So overall, looking at the last 5 December book hauls that I have done, I got 25 books for my library. I've read 11. That's 44%. So when I do these book haul revisits, I'm always hoping to be somewhere around the 50% mark for the books that I have read. So 44% is not far off of that. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. I've unhauled 9 of the 25 books, which is 36%. But again, if I read a book and unhauled it, I'm not really worried about that anymore. Let's talk about how many of the books I unhauled without actually reading them. And that actually is only 3 out of the 25, which is not bad. That's only 12%. My guiding principle, which is based on really nothing, is that I would like to keep that number under 15% if possible. And I'm close, but I'm still under it, which is great. If you have thoughts about any of these books, I would love to hear them in the comment section down below. And if you have recommendations for anything you think I should prioritize, let me know. I always appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.